my own story was I actually grew up in Los Angeles, California, to Korean immigrant parents. And, so I grew up actually being part of a local church context, an immigrant church context. And my parents were very hardworking. The story they would tell us ever since we were young kids was basically, we bought a one-way ticket here, so you better get into Harvard. So, and like that's literally kind of the mantra that was kind of seared into my psyche as a little kid was basically like, you have
Wow.
no other options. We have no other options. Um, so make it work. And so as a result, there was a certain kind of drivenness that grew in me. Now, growing up in the local church, though, my dad and I had a really harsh relationship. Not only my dad and I, but it was also the three brothers that I had, the four brothers. We all had a very harsh and acrimonious relationship with my dad. My dad
Mm,
was a very strong, overpowering, and often violent person towards us and towards my mom. And so, because of that, we just grew up despising him, and being really wounded by him. And it's taken me years to kind of just process through some of that impact. But part of our significant story was he ended up going into ministry, into vocational ministry as a pastor himself. And after he went into ministry as a pastor, uh, his behavior didn't change. So you could imagine some of the dissonance of like, wait a minute, my father's a pastor, and here we are, and we see the way that he treats mom and the way that he treats us. And how can we reconcile all the things that he's doing and talking about? As my dad becomes a pastor, he ends up writing a book, and the book ends up becoming a bestseller in Korea. So it ends up becoming this bestseller in Korea. And so he ends up leaving pastoring a local church and he ends up writing a number of books. So he started out in air conditioning and refrigeration, became a pastor later in life, which was much to our surprise. And then since then, from the age of 40 to today, he's 79 years old. He's written, so in those, basically in the 39 years, he's written 40 books. Now, the topic of the books and the platform that he's written on is how to raise a family. So you can imagine, like, some of the pain of my own background is like reconciling faith that somehow my dad then became like this very influential pastor and speaker in Korea, speaking on some of the largest stages in the world. And yet, and here he was writing these books on how to raise a family. And my brothers and I have wrestled so deeply because our relationship with him did not change much. Now it's changed considerably, um,
mm,
due to a number of, things. I think Bella, when you talk about forgiveness and all that stuff, like so appropriate. But anyhow, I might be going off the rails here, but part of that journey for me then was reconciling, like, do I believe in this Jesus who calls us to a certain way? When the biggest example to me of what faith is like, I was seeing so many different markers of hypocrisy.
mm,
And so later in college, when I made a decision for faith, I remember being all in with Jesus, despite people often say, you're a pastor because you grew up in the church and your father was a pastor. And I often say to them, no, 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 I'm not a pastor because of that. I'm a pastor despite that. Uh,
mm,
and but seeing who Jesus was really drew me to Jesus. But early in my college years, then I found myself then growing in leadership, being passionate for the word. But my senior year in college, when I knew I wanted to go into vocational ministry, I ended up my senior year. I remember, this is back when there weren't many filters on the internet and things like that. And I remember click, 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 and clicked on some links that I didn't know what they were, and immediately pornographic images filled the screen, and I was hooked.
mm,
And I did what any kind of young leader in that context, which was very driven by hiding and shame and putting on a front, did. I told no one. And here I was. Um, that's when I ended up coming to New York City to do an internship at the church where Russ and I met, at this church called New Life Fellowship. And New Life Fellowship was a church that really invited people to be honest and to confront some of the deepest parts of who they were and their past and their family of origin. Um, and it was an incredibly grace-filled community, but also a challenging community in the ways that it called us to mature. And for the
Mm.
first time in my life, I was introduced to this concept of integrating my public life as well as my private life. And so here I was as this intern at a church, but I was replicating the same way that my dad did ministry, which was basically this kind of public life and this private world that was very different.
Mm.
And so, through God's grace, being at that church, and Pete and Jerry Scazzaro hadn't written anything yet, but they actually, Pete was inviting me. I remember as an intern being invited to explore some of the woundedness of my past with my dad, being invited to confront the parts of shame that allowed me to kind of stay hidden and to hide parts of who I was, even as a leader within the church, as a young leader within the church. And needless to say, emotionally healthy discipleship drastically changed my life and trajectory. And so anyhow, so that's how I got introduced to emotionally healthy discipleship. And then 10 years later is when I left New Life Fellowship to start the church that we now lead called Hope Church NYC.